7 cold cases that were solved in 2023. 1. Debbie Lyn Randall. Police in Georgia were finally able to give the family of a 9-year-old some answers after they finally cracked her murder case after nearly 52 years. Debbie Lyn Randall went missing from Marietta while walking home from a laundromat, and her remains were only found 16 days later. She had been raped and strangled to death. The Cobb County District Attorney's Office this week named William B. Rose of Mableton as the suspect in her killing. Rose was only 24 at the time and committed suicide 2 years after Debbie Lyn's murder. Dolphin D. Brody Jr. said in a statement after the announcement, "The loss of a loved one, especially one of such a tender age, is difficult to comprehend. This family has waited for decades for an answer. This information will not replace the pain of losing Debbie Lyn. We are very grateful for the unwavering dedication, persistence, and commitment of DIT, Ron Alter of the Cold Case Unit, and all our partner agencies to provide some closure to this case." Brody insisted the DA's office remained committed to delivering justice regardless of how much time has passed, as he commended the Marietta Police Department for their meticulous efforts to give Debbie Lyn's family some closure. He added, "The answers provided today will not bring her back, and we cannot extract justice from the perpetrator, but I know he must answer to a higher power." The Cobb County Cold Case Unit reopened the case after receiving the 9-year-old's file into 015 and started testing evidence found near her body for DNA. The latest DNA technology made it possible for the detectives to create a familial DNA profile that linked Rose to Debbie Lyn's murder. After he was exhumed in 2023, cold case investigator Ron Alter said, "The team was able to establish a profile after a distant relative of the suspected killer uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy website. Police were able to link the DNA to traces found at the crime scene and ultimately identified Rose as the likely suspect." Debbie Lyn's brother Melvin thanked the investigators for continuing to look for his sister's murderer after more than 50 years. "I wish my mother was here, but I know she knows in heaven now that it's finally over. And we just want to say that we thank all of you for what you've done," he said. Melvin, who was 10 when Debbie Lyn was abducted and killed, said he had been sick the day of her disappearance and had been unable to go outside with her on that fated January morning in 1972. "After a while, I blamed myself for it, because I was her big brother and I battled with it for a while. But then I realized that there was nothing I could have done, and it just happened. And it wasn't my fault. I'm just grateful for the community," he added. Police determined Rose had relatives living near the apartment complex where Debbie Lyn and her brother lived with their family. Alter hypothesized the suspected killer likely had seen the 9-year-old before and possibly took her as a crime of opportunity. "If he drove by, I'm sure he saw her. I believe that was a crime of opportunity. He saw her by herself and abducted her," he said. He noted Rose had not been on the radar at all, and his only previous encounter with the law was an alcohol-related arrest. 2. Laura Kempton. A homicide case that went cold for more than 40 years has been solved with the help of forensic genetic genealogy technology. New Hampshire Attorney General John M. Formeller said Thursday investigators sifted through hundreds of leads after 23-year-old Laura Kempton was found dead in her Portsmouth apartment in September 1981 by a police officer who was trying to serve her a court summons. A release from the Attorney General says an autopsy revealed she died from massive trauma to a side of her head. But it wasn't until 2020 that investigators analyzed DNA samples taken from Kempton's body using genetic genealogy, a technique that compares unidentified DNA, such as from a crime scene, to DNA in genealogy databases to narrow down suspects or identify their relatives. That testing In addition to further investigation and DNA testing in 2023, helped investigators conclude that Ronnie James Lee was responsible for Kempton's death. The release said Lee died in 2005 at the age of 45. Due to acute cocaine intoxication, he was 21 when Kempton was killed, the Attorney General said. If Lee were still alive, authorities would have sought charges of first-degree murder against him, Formella said. The DNA samples that helped link Lee to the case were found on Kempton's body, a pillowcase and cigarette, but left at the scene. According to an investigative report from the Attorney General, when a DNA sample from the crime scene was uploaded to a public genetic genealogy database in 2022, investigators identified a person in that database who was a relative of whoever had that DNA. The report reads, investigators then identified the biological parents of the person with that DNA and then determined those parents shared only one biological son, Ronnie James Lee, according to the report. Armed with that information, investigators then got DNA from Lee's blood card from his autopsy. Testing in 2022 and 2023 showed his DNA matched various DNA samples from the crime scene. The report reads, Lee worked in Portsmouth at the time of Kempton's killing. According to the report, Kempton's family released a statement expressing its gratitude to those who investigated the case. Their diligence and determination, along with extraordinary personal commitment over the past decades, have led to this moment for Laura, the family said. 3. Sharon Prior. Canadian police said Tuesday they have solved one of the highest-profile cold cases in Quebec history, linking the 1975 rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl to a West Virginia man who died more than 40 years ago. Police in Longueuil, Quebec, said that DNA evidence allows them to be 100% certain that Franklin Maywood Rahman murdered teenager Sharon Prior in the Montreal suburb. The body of Rahman, who was born in 1946 in West Virginia's second-largest city of Huntington, and died in 1982 at the age of 36 in Verdun, Montreal under mysterious circumstances, was exhumed from a West Virginia cemetery in early May for DNA testing intended to confirm his link to the crime. Longueuil police say the DNA of Rahman, who had a long criminal history, matches a sample found at the murder scene. He also matched a witness' physical description of the suspect. The rape and killing of Prior had gone unsolved since she disappeared on March 29, 1975, after setting out to meet friends at a pizza parlor near her home in Montreal's Pointe St. Charles neighborhood. Her body was found 3 days later in a wooded area in Longueuil. On Montreal's South Shore, law enforcement investigated more than 100 suspects over the years, but never made any arrests. Yvonne Prior, the teenager's mother, is now in her 80s, still lives in Canada, and has spent her life searching for her daughter's killer. Romin's name didn't come up in investigation until last year, according to WCHS-TV of Charleston, West Virginia, when Longueuil police said started looking through criminal records. They found an extensive history of violence and attempts by Rahman to evade law enforcement. By moving between West Virginia and Canada, Rahman first attempted escape from the West Virginia Penitentiary in 1964 and later escaped in 1967. According to records obtained by WCHS, 2 years later, Rahman already had a Canadian rap sheet. In 1974, he was arrested for breaking into a house and raping a woman in Parkersburg, West Virginia. He was released on a $2,500 bond 2 months later and fled to Canada. According to an Associated Press story from the time, just months after Prior's murder in 1975, Rahman was captured by Canadian border officials and extradited back to West Virginia, where he was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison for sexual assault in the Parkersburg case. He died in Canada in 1982, shortly after his release. although officials say they haven't been able to find a death certificate detailing the circumstances that lead to his death. His body was returned to his mother in West Virginia, where his family buried him in the Putnam County, West Virginia Pine Grove Cemetery. When Rahman was exhumed last month, local prosecutor Mark Searsier called the crime against Prior the most evil element in the human race. It's a combination of the most evil element in the human race contacting the most innocent element in the human race, a child, he told WCHS. Some things are worse than death. Losing a child like that, for a family, for a mom, to know that your child died that way. For Rita Curran. In 1971, Rita Curran, a 24-year-old school teacher, was found strangled to death in her apartment in Vermont, the college town of Burlington, where Curran taught second grade, was devastated. Police interviewed Curran's neighbors, investigated hundreds of tips and collected evidence, including a single cigarette but found near her arm, but were unable to name her killer. Curran's murder, unsolved for more than 5 decades, became one of Vermont's most notorious cold cases. That changed this week when police detectives announced the identity of her murderer, a male neighbor, police say, who later became a Buddhist monk and countercultural guru before dying of an overdose in 1986. DNA technology and genealogical research have linked the cigarette but found near Curran's body to William Dearuse, who lived upstairs in the same apartment block. Investigators interviewed Dearuse in the 1970s but ruled him out. We're all confident that William Dearuse is responsible for the aggravated murder of Rita Curran, Lt. Jim Tribe, a Burlington police detective, announced on Tuesday. This case is the latest example of forensic science catching up to crimes formerly considered unsolvable, sometimes long after perpetrators are themselves gone. Even though he's dead and there won't be justice, it is a really positive outcome. Cease Moore, a genealogical investigator at Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs, said, Moore's research identified Dearuse, and it is a great illustration of how investigative genetic genealogy is resolving these cases that so many people have cared about for so many years. In the summer of 1971, Curran had recently moved into a shared apartment. She was working as a hotel maid and taking graduate courses at the University of Vermont while waiting for school to start. Round midnight on the 19th of July, her housemates found her dead. She had been attacked, sexually assaulted, and asphyxiated. Dearuse, who lived 2 floors above Curran with his then-wife, was not one of the investigation's 13 main suspects. His wife told police that they were home all night. Patrick Leahy, the retired U.S. Senator representing Vermont, was the area's county prosecutor at the time. In 2016, Leahy said that police and prosecutors had, for a period, considered Ted Bundy a suspect. Bundy, who was born in Burlington, was thought to have been in the area around the time Curran died, shortly before his execution in 1989. However, he denied responsibility. Curran's death became known as Burlington's oldest cold case murder. In 2014, Burlington police decided to reprocess the evidence using modern technology. Male DNA was found on the cigarette found near Curran's body, but it did not match a national felon database or any of the 13 primary suspects. The Burlington police reopened the case again in 2019. Detectives sent the cigarette DNA to PARAB on. It took Moore only a few hours to identify Dearuse. At the top of the list were 2 people who shared enough DNA, with the unknown suspect to be his first cousin once removed, Moore said. And those matches ended up being on both sides of his family tree. That's extremely unusual. It was shocking. Testing of DNA on Curran's house code confirmed the findings. When police re-interviewed Dearuse's wife, she admitted to deceiving detectives. She said Dearuse, who had a criminal history, had persuaded her that she had to protect him from false incrimination. The couple had married 2 Weeks earlier, I think she lied at the time because she was young. She was naive, she was newly married, she was in love. Thomas Jeanette, a Burlington detective, told the press on Tuesday. In actuality, she and Dearuse had argued that night. Dearuse left the apartment and returned while she was asleep. He and his wife left Vermont. Soon afterward, they separated, and Dearuse moved to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. A few years later, he surfaced in California, where he remarried and was known as a countercultural guru called Dutch. Dearuse's second wife, from whom he also became estranged, told police that he had a violent temper and had once choked her and non-fatally stabbed a friend. About 15 years after Curran's death, he died of a drug overdose in a San Francisco hotel room. Moore said that her discovery would not have been possible without earlier work by the investigators and generations of detectives over many years. I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through. Curran's brother, Tom Curran, recently told the press. 5. Carol Sue Clayber. It took multiple generations of Boone County, Kentucky homicide investigators to finally bring to a close the case of Carol Sue Clayber, pictured above in a news report, who was sexually assaulted and murdered all the way back in 1976, speaking with the New York Times. In March 2023, soon after the conclusion was announced, investigator Coy Cox revealed how former colleague Jerry Keith had obsessively compiled information on the case, keeping the file with him at his home. He literally carried this case with him his whole life. Cox said, while the suspects Detective Keith had focused on did not pan out, Detective Cox nevertheless credits him with helping bring the case to its eventual closure, noting, a lot of times, you have to prove who didn't do it to get to who did. Detective Coy Cox of the Boone County Sheriff's Office in Kentucky pulled up a chair. We have the ultimate answer in the case, and we're going to share that with you, the detective recalled telling Mr. Clayber. I'll tell you as little or as much as you want to know. Mr. Clayber, who had volunteered in June 1976 to identify the body of his 16-year-old sister, Carol Sue Clayber, a moment that has tortured him ever since, did not hesitate. I want to hear it, he said. On Wednesday, about a week after informing Mr. Clayber, the sheriff's office announced that it had solved a cold case that had thrust the Clayber family into a decades-long tangle of mystery and frustration after Ms. Clayber was sexually assaulted and killed in Kentucky in 1976. Her body was found on June 5th that year in Walton, Key, about 60 miles north of Lexington. Investigators had scoured the grassy hills of Boone County, which borders the Ohio River, for clues. Through DNA evidence, the sheriff's office concluded that Thomas W. Dunaway, who was then 19, had killed Ms. Clayber. At the time, Mr. Dunaway had been living in Park Hills, where Ms. Clayber, who played the violin and loved her acoustic guitar, was last seen getting into a car, possibly a gray Chevrolet or Pontiac Grand Prix, Detective Cox said. It was possible that Mr. Dunaway and Ms. Clayber knew each other in the neighborhood, he said. Mr. Clayber, a retired bass trombonist for the Cleveland Orchestra, took a deep breath when he heard the news. When he exhaled, you could see, physically, his body just kind of settled into it, Detective Cox said. Still, there was a lingering sense of anger for Mr. Clayber when he learned that Mr. Dunaway had died in 1990 at the age of 33. That meant no formal charges, no trial, no chance to sit in a courtroom and look at the man responsible for his sister's killing. I wish I had known in 1990. What do you say after all this time? Mr. Clayber said, adding, I had some rather unchristian plans for him. Well, the answers brought some relief. He said he had a new thorny question to reckon with. What does justice mean now? One former detective with the Boone County Sheriff's Office, Jerry Keith, had obsessively tried to bring the investigation to a close years ago. He had a copy of the case report at his home, He literally carried this case with him his whole life, Detective Cox said. Before his death in September 2017, Mr. Keith had developed theories that pointed to two possible assailants that same year. The sheriff's office established its cold case unit, staffed by Detective Cox and Detective Tim Adams, and together they pursued Mr. Keith's theories. In the end, the killer was neither of the possible assailants Mr. Keith had considered. But Detective Cox said he was grateful to the former detective because in cases, a lot of times, you have to prove who didn't do it to get to who did. The detective sent DNA left by the killer on the victim to a lab to be tested through genetic genealogy, the process in which DNA samples are used to find relatives of suspects, which in this case was Mr. Dunaway. Detectives traveled to meet a child of Mr. Dunaway's, who had never really known their father, to collect DNA. They were shocked. Detective Cox said of the child, who was not identified. The detectives then learned more about Mr. Dunaway's past. He had killed another person, Ron Townsend, in northern Kentucky in December 1976, just months after Miss Clayber was killed, and served more than 7 years in prison for that crime. He had also enlisted in the U.S. Army days. After Miss Clayber's body was found, on Christmas Eve of that year, he had been arrested in South Carolina for burning a Chevrolet Impala and illegally possessing a sawed-off shotgun. On March 1st, Mr. Clayber sat in his chair. Taking in all the investigative findings, the case had traumatized his family, including his older brother, and he had long wondered why he hadn't sought therapy after seeing what the killer had done to his sister. He said that sight had left him with a vague darkness. Somewhere down inside me, his son, Daniel Clayber, 28, said that when he was out late with friends, his father would frantically call several times and plead, "It's been too long, call me, where are you?" Whenever someone was overdue, I would start not just worrying, but I was expecting this to happen again, the senior Mr. Clayber said. This month, as he processed the news from the detectives, he realized that one small detail gave him comfort. All his life, he had worried about investigators potentially exhuming his sister to collect DNA. Detective Cox told him that, in the end, it was Mr. Dunaway's body that had been exhumed for that reason. "There's a little bit of justice," Mr. Clayber said. "You're going to disturb somebody's remains. Dig him up." 6. Vicky Johnson. A family in Seaside is finally receiving closure. After a decades-old cold case was solved, young mother, Vicki Johnson, was horrifically murdered back in 1991. This murder left a mark on the entire community of Seaside. On January 3, 1991, Seaside police arrived at Sabato Park in the early morning hours, only to find 34-year-old Johnson's body lying on the sand on the playground. She endured a very brutal death right at this park. She was suffocated and strangled. She had a significant amount of sand that was lodged down her throat, as if her head had been held in the sand. She had bite marks along her body from the perpetrator and her clothes were torn. And she was set on fire, her upper torso, part of her clothing set on fire, said Seaside Police Chief Nick Borges. Borges said, at the time, Seaside was known as a violent community. As the crack epidemic overtook it and was crime-infested, this case only amplified that reputation. Back then, nobody called, no one saw this. There's no witnesses to the scene. How is that even possible? That goes back to the culture that existed in this community, that it was such a scary, violent place. Nobody would even call the police to tell us, Borges said, due to the lack of leads. The case was left cold until 2 years ago. Investigators with the Seaside Police Department and the Monterey County Cold Case Task Force used DNA from under Johnson's fingernails, tracing it back to Frank Louis McClure. McClure was never held accountable for the crime. Police believe he died peacefully in his Seaside home in 2021. It's just so unfortunate that something like this would happen, said Mark Vaughn, a longtime Seaside resident, Vaughn knew Johnson for many years, calling the incident a big tragedy and says it's about time they've gotten to the bottom of it. I went to school with her, Fremont Junior High, and she was a nice person and I knew the family. It just seemed like just a beautiful family and I'm wondering what happened, Vaughn said. Vaughn said through his years of living in Seaside, he's seen it transform for the better. There were things going on that aren't going on now. And there were groups that weren't doing good things. And so now I think there's been a change of culture, Vaughn said. Johnson left behind 3 sons. Authorities hope this discovery brings her family the closure they've been longing for. Right now, Seaside has 30 to open cases they continue to actively try and solve. Borges said they aren't going to stop until they solve all of them. 7. Cathy Sposito, standing at the podium in front of a line of television cameras. Rich Finston became emotional thinking back to his early work on the murder case of Catherine Sposito, the first cold case he was assigned when he joined the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office as a cold case volunteer 12 years ago. Now, more than 3 decades after Sposito was killed while hiking on Prescott's Thumb Butte Trail, investigators have used DNA analysis to identify her killer. I am saying today with high confidence, Cathy Sposito was murdered by Brian Scott Bennett, Sheriff David Rhodes said during a news conference Friday. After biking to the popular trail on the morning of June 13, 1987, 23-year-old Sposito was attacked and ultimately killed. People nearby reported hearing screams, but by the time they found her, she was dead, Rhodes said. There is no indication that Sposito knew Bennett, who was a 16-year-old Prescott High School student at the time of the murder, before crossing paths on the morning of the murder, Rhodes said. Over the past 37 years, numerous investigators worked on the Sposito case as they made their way through the agency's ranks, including Rhodes himself, who worked on the case as a young deputy in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He said, "This rotating team of investigators for cold cases can sometimes lead to things being missed," Finston said, which is where the volunteers step in. When continuity gets lost, things fall into cracks, Finston said, and so we kind of find cracks and try to fill them. In a smaller agency that is already tasked with ensuring public safety across the thousands of square miles in Yavapai County, deputies don't always have the ability to set aside the time and focus that poring over decades of case documents requires. Instead, the cold case team, composed of 6 volunteers overseen by a homicide detective, works hand in hand with experienced investigators to meticulously make its way through mountains of evidence. There's never a time when full-time paid detectives could spend this amount of time working on cases that are so old. Because the resources are not there, they carry caseloads. They're busy doing things all the time, and so really, I can say with absolute certainty, we would not be here today if it was not for the dedicated, competent work of our volunteers, Rhodes said. They have the time to really sit down and focus on nothing but that, he said. Finston's past career as a military investigator with the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War and later roles as an engineer and scientist would prove to be beneficial to his work on the cold case team, which Finston called interestingly tedious. His affinity for numbers eventually led to him becoming the go-to guy for DNA evidence analysis on the Sposito case. He said, investigators conducted genealogical testing on DNA from an unknown male collected during the investigation into an April 1990 sexual assault on Thumb Butte Trail in almost the same location of Sposito's murder. They were able to identify a female descendant who provided the names of 2 potential suspects, Brian Scott Bennett or his younger brother. Bennett, who died by suicide in 1994, was exhumed in 2022 to retrieve DNA samples that confirmed that he was in fact the attacker in that assault. Finston then compared his DNA to the profiles collected in Sposito's case. But as is often the situation with cold cases this old, getting perfect DNA matches becomes even more difficult because of the vastly different practice for evidence handling and DNA collection at the time of the original crime. You don't know what you don't know, right? Rhodes said. So when they're handling the evidence all these years ago, they don't know what somebody's going to care about later. For example, a wrench that was found up the trail from Sposito's body and is believed to have been used during the attack tested positive for multiple DNA contributors after another hiker carried it from its original location and handed it to a law enforcement officer on scene. When you have multiple contributors, the only thing you can do analytically is develop a likelihood that your suspect touched it, Finston said. When you look at the bigger picture, Finston said, including the fact that the majority of the DNA on the wrench belonged to Bennett, coupled with his positive identification in the 1990 assault, which featured striking commonalities to Sposito's murder, including the time of day, location, and modus operandi, Bennett was determined to be the culprit. The compelling body of evidence is the combination of the likelihood of DNA and the circumstantial evidence of the behavior of Brian Bennett, Finston said, especially his involvement in two later sexual assaults in July 1990 and June 1993, wherein both survivors identified Bennett as their attacker and reported that he threatened to kill them. Bennett was never charged with Sposito's murder or the assaults in April 1990 or June 1993. He was found not guilty of attempted sexual assault for the July 1990 case, his third known assault. Bennett was only ever convicted of check forgery, for which he spent time on probation. Renee Sandoval, Bennett's fourth known victim, speaks out on June 2nd, 1993. 25-year-old Renee Sandoval was taken at knife point from the post office by Bennett and was sexually assaulted before a Prescott police officer pulled over the car they were driving in and interrupted the attack. But Bennett was never charged in her case, and he died less than a year later. Cathy, you're free, Sandoval said during Friday's event. We're always going to be tied together. We're always going to have a connection, she said of Sposito. She will be with me till the day I die. Sandoval spent decades waiting for justice that she thought would never come, she said. That long wait for justice made it even more important to her that she share her story. I haven't had a voice about this in 30-something years. It's time, she told the Republic. The day Sandoval learned of Friday's official announcement, she said she was overcome with emotion until a photo she had taken on Thumb Butte suddenly popped up on her phone. A clear sign from Sposito, she said, reminding her, "You live for me, and I will," Sandoval said, tearfully, because she didn't get the chance now that she's found some peace. Sandoval hopes that her words and Bennett's identification will encourage more survivors to come forward to share their stories and seek the help they need to move forward. Sandoval has found his support system with the Sposito family and Bennett's other survivors, she said, who she communicates with almost daily. We don't know each other, but we feel like we do, she said, and it's great for all of us to have that support system of each other. We're connected the same way. Sandoval is hoping for assault survivors to come forward. Law enforcement officials made a plea to the public for any additional information about Bennett, especially regarding any unreported assaults. We want to encourage other victims that we may not know about, or that we may not have heard of, or they may not have reported what happened to them to come forward, and perhaps we can provide some closure, Rhodes said. While they haven't yet connected Bennett to any other crimes in the state or around the country, officials believe there's a good chance there are more survivors out there. It is very unlikely, given the frequency of which he was willing to act, that these are the only 4 cases that exist. Rhodes said, and while Bennett's death prevents justice from being brought in court, it not only brings long-sought peace for the survivors and the Sposito family, but it allows the sheriff's office to release the case information and really let the public have their opinion about what they think happened, Rhodes said. Further, Rhodes said, the fact that Bennett died by suicide in 1994 potentially spared 3 decades of additional victims at the rate that he was victimizing people. That's 30 years that he would have had to be out there continuing to victimize other people, he said.